Power doesn't turn people cruel, it turns them useful. Systems do not select obedience because it is moral, they select it because it is quiet, predictable, and cheap to maintain. The obedient do not need to be threatened, they self-regulate. They anticipate expectations before they are spoken. They correct themselves before punishment is required. That is why good people are always chosen, not because they are trusted, but because they remove friction from power. And the intelligent ones, the ones who sense the structure behind the language, are rarely promoted. They destabilize narratives by noticing them, so they are sidelined, mislabeled, or quietly erased, because obedience keeps systems alive, but clarity makes them visible, and visibility is always dangerous. People misunderstand Machiavelli because they read him as a teacher of cruelty rather than a diagnostician of decay. They search his work for permission to dominate instead of warnings about what domination does to perception. Power games exist whether you participate or not because they are not moral choices. They are structural responses to scarcity, fear, and hierarchy. Every institution eventually organizes itself around control of behavior, not truth. Moral language is introduced later as lubrication. It explains obedience in ways that feel noble, so compliance does not feel like surrender. This is where moral autopilot becomes dangerous. When people outsource judgment to roles, rules, or reputations, they stop perceiving reality directly. They obey symbols instead of outcomes. Titles replace competence. Intent replaces impact. Goodness becomes a measurable performance instead of a private discipline. Systems favor this because moral autopilot produces reliability. Reliable people do not question framing. They ask how to serve better, not whether the service itself is destructive. Authority rarely needs force because obedience is trained long before power is applied. Shame teaches the boundary. Reward teaches the rhythm. Belonging teaches silence. Most people do not obey because they are stupid. They obey because obedience feels safer than isolation. It offers protection from uncertainty. It promises that someone else is responsible. This is why power reshapes perception before it corrupts behavior. Once perception is narrowed, behavior follows automatically. People inside the system believe they are choosing when they are only selecting from approved options. This analysis is not here to empower you or offer escape routes. It is observational. It is a warning label, not a map. Understanding these mechanisms does not make you immune. It only makes you aware of what you are standing inside. And awareness is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Once you see how obedience is engineered, you can no longer call it accidental. And once you see that intelligence threatens stability more than disobedience ever, could you understand why systems reward goodness and punish clarity without ever admitting it? If you approve this section, I will proceed to the autopsy subjects, where the mechanisms are dissected one by one as systems, not villains. The credential cage symbol, the collar. The scene is always quiet. A well-lit office, a conference room, a hallway where people speak softly and nod often. Nothing looks violent. Everyone has a title. Everyone has earned something. Degree certificates, years of service, badges of legitimacy hang invisibly around their necks. The person in power does not think of themselves as oppressive. Their internal logic is procedural. They believe authority flows from qualification, and that qualification proves judgment. To them, power is not taken, it is inherited through systems of validation. They trust the credential because it simplifies uncertainty. It tells them who deserves to be heard before a word is spoken. The compliant individual standing across from them has already rehearsed silence. Their inner dialogue is disciplined. Say what is expected. Do not sound threatening. Intelligence is filtered through politeness. Insight is trimmed until it fits the role. The mechanism sustaining this system is substitution. Credentials replace perception. Once the badge is present, the system no longer needs to evaluate reality directly. It evaluates alignment. Those without credentials are invisible. Those with excessive clarity are dangerous because clarity questions whether the collar itself is necessary. The cold law here is this: Authority prefers proof of obedience over evidence of truth. The unresolved tension is that the system slowly fills with qualified people who no longer see clearly, while those who see clearly are forced outside, where their understanding rots into resentment or silence. The loyal instrument symbol, the leash. The scene is familiar and intimate. A trusted subordinate stays late, answers messages, immediately anticipates needs without being asked. Loyalty is visible in posture, tone, and timing. The person in power reads this loyalty as virtue. Their internal logic is relational, not strategic. They believe loyalty indicates shared values and that shared values reduce risk. In reality, loyalty reduces friction. The compliant individual experiences loyalty as safety. Their inner dialogue repeats a single question: if I remain useful, will I remain protected? They mistake proximity for security. They translate approval into survival. The system is sustained by intermittent reinforcement. Loyalty is rewarded just enough to prevent withdrawal, but never enough to create independence. Praise replaces pay. Access replaces autonomy. The obedient instrument becomes essential but never sovereign. The cold law is this: loyalty is valued not because it is moral, but because it disables exit. The unresolved tension is that loyalty eventually demands sacrifice. When values conflict with commands, the loyal instrument must amputate part of their own judgment to remain attached. Each cut dulls perception further until obedience feels like identity. The shame accountant symbol, the ledger. This system operates without commands. The scene is internal. A person pauses before speaking, calculates tone, edits thought, and withholds observation. No one is watching yet. Compliance occurs. The authority figure does not need to intervene. Their internal logic is invisible. They believe order is maintained because people understand consequences. They call this maturity. The compliant individual keeps a running ledger of social debt. If I say this, will I be seen as difficult? If I refuse, will I lose belonging? Their inner dialogue is crowded with imaginary observers. The mechanism sustaining this system is anticipatory punishment. Shame is installed early, then outsourced to the individual. Control becomes efficient because it no longer requires presence. The cold law is this: the most stable form of obedience is self-administered. The unresolved tension is that once shame governs perception, truth becomes indistinguishable from risk. Clarity is felt as danger, not insight. The narrative janitor symbol, the broom. The scene is public but sanitized. Meetings, press releases, family conversations, institutions explaining themselves. The person in power believes stability depends on coherence. Their internal logic frames dissent as disorder, not because it is false, but because it disrupts narrative flow. The compliant individual cleans language before it becomes disruptive. They soften truths, contextualize harm, and translate contradictions into acceptable explanations. Their inner dialogue asks, not is this true, but is this manageable? The mechanism sustaining this system is moral framing. Language absorbs impact, so structure remains intact. The cold law is this: systems survive by controlling meaning, not outcomes. The unresolved tension is that reality accumulates beneath the narrative. Eventually, the cost of cleaning exceeds the benefit of silence. The threat of clarity symbol, the mirror. This structure is less visible because it is preventative. The scene is exclusion. A promotion that never arrives, a voice that is politely ignored, a contributor labeled difficult despite accuracy. The person in power does not consciously reject intelligence. Their internal logic treats clarity as volatility. Clear thinkers expose assumptions. They ask structural questions. They create mirrors where none are wanted. The compliant group senses this threat and distances itself. Their inner dialogue is defensive. Do not associate. Do not echo. Survival requires alignment. The mechanism sustaining this system is social triangulation. Intelligence is isolated, not attacked. The cold law is this: systems eliminate those who see patterns, not those who break rules. The unresolved tension is that removing clarity does not remove consequence. It only delays recognition. The threat of clarity continues, symbol the mirror. Over time, the system learns to recognize clarity before it speaks. It does not wait for dissent. It scans tone, pacing, and framing. People who speak too cleanly are flagged, not because they are wrong, but because they reduce ambiguity. Ambiguity is protective. The person in power experiences clarity as exposure. Their internal logic reframes this discomfort as instability. They tell themselves that clear thinkers are rigid, impractical, or unsafe for cohesion. The compliant observer internalizes the lesson. Their inner dialogue adjusts. Do not finish the thought. Do not name the pattern. Ask a question instead of stating a conclusion. The mechanism that sustains this structure is preemptive dilution. Clarity is forced to fragment into suggestions, hypotheticals, and soft language until it no longer threatens the frame. The cold law is this: power tolerates intelligence only when it is exhausted by caution. The unresolved tension is that the system still depends on intelligence to function while ensuring that intelligence never points back at the system itself. The rotation of obedience symbol, the turnstile. The scene is procedural and cyclical. Committees, reviews, performance cycles, reorganizations. People move, but nothing changes. The person in power believes renewal equals progress. Their internal logic treats motion as reform. By rotating obedient individuals through roles, the system maintains energy without altering structure. The compliant individual interprets movement as advancement. Their inner dialogue is hopeful but contained. Maybe next cycle, maybe next review. The mechanism sustaining this pattern is deferred fulfillment. Reward is always close enough to motivate, but distant enough to avoid delivery. The cold law is this: systems promise future recognition to extract present compliance. The unresolved tension is cumulative fatigue. Over time, the obedient learn to conserve effort while maintaining appearance. Engagement becomes performative. The system survives but hollows out. The consensus engine symbol, the round table. The scene appears democratic. Voices are invited. Opinions are shared. Decisions are made by agreement. The person in power believes consensus legitimizes outcomes. Their internal logic equates harmony with correctness. In practice, consensus filters out uncomfortable data before it enters the room. The compliant participant calibrates contribution. Their inner dialogue monitors reactions. Say what aligns, avoid what isolates. The mechanism sustaining this engine is social proof. Once a position is shared by enough people, it becomes safe regardless of accuracy. The cold law is this: consensus measures comfort, not truth. The unresolved tension is stagnation. Novel insights rarely survive the first glance. Innovation is welcomed only after it is no longer disruptive. The moral buffer symbol, the halo. This structure protects authority from scrutiny. The scene involves good intentions, charity, language, and visible care. The person in power believes morality shields them from abuse. Their internal logic assumes benevolence cancels harm. The compliant individual absorbs this framing. Their inner dialogue reframes doubt as ingratitude. How can something be wrong if it means well? The mechanism sustaining this buffer is ethical offsetting. Harm is balanced against virtue until critique feels inappropriate. The cold law is this: moral reputation is the strongest armor against accountability. The unresolved tension is suppressed contradiction. When harm persists beneath moral cover, those affected experience cognitive dissonance that erodes trust quietly. The scarcity gate symbol, the narrow door. The scene is opportunity. Limited slots, promotions, access, invitations. The person in power uses scarcity to organize behavior. Their internal logic treats competition as natural selection. The compliant individual narrows focus. Their inner dialogue becomes strategic but obedient. Outperform peers without challenging structure. The mechanism sustaining this gate is artificial limitation. Scarcity intensifies compliance because refusal feels costly. The cold law is this: scarcity converts obedience into self-interest. The unresolved tension is fragmentation. Collective clarity dissolves as individuals compete for survival within the same frame. The quiet erasure symbol, the fog. This is how systems end conversations without conflict. The scene is ambiguity. Emails, unanswered meetings, rescheduled, decisions postponed. The person in power avoids confrontation, not out of fear but efficiency. Their internal logic prefers entropy over resistance. The compliant individual feels disoriented. Their inner dialogue searches for meaning. Did I misstep? Was I unclear? The mechanism sustaining this erasure is deniability. Nothing is said, so nothing can be challenged. The cold law is this: silence is the cleanest form of exclusion. The unresolved tension is unresolved agency. People disappear without closure, which teaches observers to self-censor more effectively than punishment ever could. The internalization loop symbol, the echo. Over time, the system no longer needs external enforcement. Language, habits, values, and priorities are internalized. The person in power sees this as culture. Their internal logic celebrates alignment as maturity. The compliant individual no longer distinguishes personal belief from system preference. Their inner dialogue echoes approved narratives automatically. The mechanism sustaining this loop is repetition. What is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar feels true. The cold law is this: the deepest control feels like personal choice. The unresolved tension is identity erosion. When the system changes, those who internalized it experience loss without knowing what was taken. The compliance reward illusion symbol, the medal, recognition ceremonies, metrics, praise and visibility tokens. The scene is celebratory. The person in power believes rewards motivate excellence. Their internal logic confuses output with alignment. The compliant individual associates recognition with worth. Their inner dialogue chases validation. If I am seen, I exist. The mechanism sustaining this illusion is substitution. Medals replace autonomy. Visibility replaces freedom. The cold law is this: recognition is cheaper than empowerment. The unresolved tension is dependency. Once worth is externally defined, withdrawal feels like annihilation. The exhaustion filter symbol, the weight. The system does not need to defeat clarity. It only needs to tire it. The scene is workload urgency and constant demand. The person in power believes pressure reveals commitment. Their internal logic treats endurance as loyalty. The compliant individual postpones reflection. Their inner dialogue prioritizes survival. Think later. Finish now. The mechanism sustaining this filter is cognitive depletion. Exhausted minds do not question frames. The cold law is this: fatigue is a governance tool. The unresolved tension is delayed reckoning. When exhaustion lifts, clarity returns with interest. The inheritance of obedience symbol, the template. New members learn without instruction. The scene is onboarding, mentorship, and informal advice. The person in power believes culture transmits values. Their internal logic relies on continuity. The compliant veteran teaches survival rules quietly. Their inner dialogue rationalizes guidance as care. I am helping you adapt. The mechanism sustaining this inheritance is modeling. Behavior teaches faster than policy. The cold law is this: systems perpetuate themselves through imitation, not enforcement. The unresolved tension is generational drift. Each cycle inherits less clarity than the last. The closure of the autopsy loop symbol, the body bag. The system eventually contains its own evidence. Every mechanism feeds another. Credentials justify loyalty. Loyalty absorbs shame. Shame cleans narratives. Narratives exclude clarity. Scarcity enforces compliance. Silence erases dissent. Internalization stabilizes the frame. The person in power rarely sees the whole. Their internal logic remains local and reasonable. The compliant individual experiences the system as inevitable. The cold law that binds all others is this: obedience is selected not because it is virtuous, but because it preserves structure at the lowest cost. The unresolved tension that remains is unresolved humanity. Systems optimized for obedience cannot distinguish between stability and decay. They continue until something external interrupts or internal clarity resurfaces. This tension carries forward into the counter-awareness that follows, not as a solution but as a diagnostic shift, where participation is reduced not through attack but through withdrawal of fuel. People tolerate manipulation not because they are weak, but because manipulation rarely announces itself as control. It arrives disguised as order, stability, protection, and belonging. In the courtroom of society, the evidence shows that most people do not submit to power under threat but under narrative. They are told what is reasonable, what is normal, what is expected of someone like them. Over time, these suggestions harden into assumptions, and assumptions replace perception. Manipulation persists because it reduces cognitive load. It answers questions before they arise. It tells people who to trust, what to fear, and where responsibility ends. Clarity demands effort. It requires sitting with uncertainty and accepting isolation when conclusions do not match consensus. Comfort offers relief from that burden. So people trade awareness for ease and call it maturity. Obedience feels safer than freedom because freedom exposes consequence without insulation. Obedience offers structure. It provides rails that promise predictability. When people obey, they believe outcomes are no longer fully theirs to carry. Authority absorbs blame. Systems absorb guilt. This psychological outsourcing is soothing. It allows individuals to act without fully owning impact. Freedom removes that buffer. It forces direct contact with cause and effect. That contact is unsettling. It makes mistakes visible and success lonely. So obedience is framed as responsibility while freedom is framed as recklessness. The jury must notice how this framing reverses reality. Power systems persist because they align incentives with compliance rather than truth. They reward behavior that maintains flow, not behavior that corrects direction. People inside these systems rarely see themselves as corrupt. They follow procedures, meet targets, and fulfill roles. Each action is defensible in isolation. Harm emerges cumulatively, and by the time it is visible, no single actor feels accountable. This diffusion of responsibility is the backbone of persistence. When everyone participates a little, no one feels responsible enough to stop. Manipulation survives because people choose comfort over clarity, not once but repeatedly. Each small concession seems harmless. Each silence feels temporary. Each compromise feels strategic. Over time, these choices solidify into identity. People begin to defend the systems that constrain them because those systems validate their past decisions. To question the structure would require questioning oneself. That is the hidden cost of obedience. It binds self-worth to compliance. Boundaries feel cruel only to those who profit from their absence, because boundaries interrupt extraction. They expose imbalance. When someone refuses to over-explain, over-give, or over-absorb discomfort, the system interprets this as hostility, not because harm is being done, but because efficiency is being lost. Boundaries reintroduce friction. They force renegotiation of roles that were previously one-sided. In the courtroom, this is where intent is confused with impact. The system claims offense to avoid adjustment. It accuses the boundary holder of selfishness, rigidity, or disloyalty. Yet boundaries do not attack. They clarify. They reveal who is benefiting quietly from ambiguity. This is why power reacts defensively to limits. Limits make transactions visible. Society is on trial here, not for cruelty, but for preference. The preference for smoothness over truth. The preference for belonging over integrity. The preference for managed narratives over direct perception. These preferences are not enforced at gunpoint. They are cultivated through reward, shame, and repetition. The verdict is uncomfortable because it is participatory. There is no singular villain. There is only a pattern of choices made daily by ordinary people seeking relief from uncertainty. Power does not need to dominate when it can persuade people to regulate themselves. Obedience feels safe because it promises that someone else is steering, but that promise is conditional and revocable. When systems fail, those who surrendered clarity discover too late that protection was never guaranteed. The court must recognize this final truth. Stability built on compliance is fragile. It depends on continued blindness, and blindness always expires. Mercy and weakness are often confused because both refuse immediate confrontation. The difference is structural, not emotional. Weakness avoids clarity to preserve comfort. Mercy accepts clarity and chooses restraint anyway. Weakness submits to avoid loss. Mercy withholds force because force is unnecessary. Systems benefit from this confusion. They label compliance as kindness and resistance as cruelty. Over time, people internalize this reversal. They fear that seeing clearly will make them harsh. In reality, clarity removes the need for excess. It allows response without distortion. Virtue without clarity is decoration. It performs goodness without understanding consequence. That is why clarity must precede virtue. Without it, morality becomes reactive and easily hijacked. People act kindly while sustaining harm because they never examined the structure they are participating in. Clarity is not loud. It does not persuade. It does not recruit. It simply names what is happening. That naming changes behavior indirectly by removing illusion. Control relies on illusion. Once illusion fades, control becomes expensive. Freedom is quieter than domination because it does not require witnesses. Domination needs performance, recognition, and reinforcement. Freedom operates without validation. It appears as withdrawal rather than conquest, as silence rather than argument, as limits rather than threats. This is why it is often mistaken for passivity. In truth, it is selective engagement. Freedom does not attempt to correct the system. It reduces exposure to it. It steps out of loops rather than breaking them. This is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of perception. When participation decreases, systems reveal their dependency. They escalate narratives, apply pressure, and accuse absence of disloyalty. None of this requires response. Clarity does not negotiate with distortion. It observes and adjusts distance. The final resolution is not control over others, but authorship of one's own attention. Once attention is reclaimed, obedience loses its grip. The system continues, but its influence narrows. This is not victory, it is containment. The quiet, kind power does not require cruelty. It only requires your participation, and participation is always a choice.